The main thrust of this paper connects with the theme of the critique of the overemphasis of the Whiteheadian cycle of precision in learning, teaching, and academic research, which I dealt with in our last chapter, in the last chapter of our 2008 edited anthology, The Adventure of Education. And there were several people in this section who published in that volume. Whitehead's doctrine of the rhythm of education is a central tenet of his philosophy of education. For him, the rhythm of education may be equally construed as the rhythm of life, since life involves rhythm, and rhythm is a chief indicator of life. As he states, life is the rhythm as such, and wherever there is rhythm, there is some life. According to Whitehead, since a learner is a living, growing organism, the process of learning consists in the cyclic passage of phases of mental growth in the same sense that life is, or appears to be, essentially periodic. It comprises daily periods with their alternations of work and play, of activity and of sleep, and seasonal periods, which dictate our terms and our holidays. And it's also composed of well-marked yearly periods. The pupil's mind is a growing organism, he says. Lack of attention to the rhythmic character of this mental growth is a main source of wooden futility in education. And he says the audience will certainly find this out for itself. So he's just suggesting that what's backing his thesis is just that educators will find out that if you don't abide by the rhythm of education, well, it's going to be an unsuccessful affair.
May I just ask from which book? I didn't.
Adventures of Education. Okay. Yeah. Or excuse me, Aims of Education. Sorry, I always get those two. Yeah, Aims. Yeah. And later, freedom and discipline should be so adjusted in the child's life that they correspond to a natural sway to and fro of developing personality. It is this adaptation of the natural sway of development that Whitehead says that I've elsewhere called the rhythm of education. I am convinced that much disappointing failure in the past has been due to the neglect of attention to this important rhythm. Now, in the next sections of the paper, I just talk about Whitehead's reference to Hegel, and I also talk a little bit about what the meaning of each of the cycles is, but I'm sure that in this section you guys have already talked about that at length, so I won't be bothered with that. Beyond Whitehead's abstract talk of rhythms in the everyday lives of students and teachers and/or beyond references to Hegel's dialectic, it would seem that the foundation for Whitehead's statement that there's an underlying rhythm involved in learning, teaching, and research that must be attended to. However, in Whiteheadian scholarship, the questions, on what scientific, biological, or factual basis is this Whiteheadian claim based? Is the notion of a rhythm of education an unfalsifiable one? These questions are usually not asked. I'll here make the claim that we can look to biology, and especially what may be called the new frontiers of biology, including epigenetics, the father of which was a Whiteheadian by the name of Conrad Hal Waddington, who I talk about in this paper. Also the theory of organic selection, or the Baldwin effect, homeostasis and chronobiology that I'll talk about in this paper, niche construction, emergentism, systems biology, etc. We can look to these new frontiers of biology to find plausible answers to these questions. These are largely holistic new frontiers of biology, which to some extent depart from mainstream neo-Darwinian biology's mechanistic reductionism, in which organisms are viewed as mere machines whose operations may be explained as the sum of the working of a linear series of causal switches or mechanisms, and that evolutionary phenomena involve nothing but natural selection acting on genotypes. For the purposes of length, here I'm only going to focus on homeostasis, chronobiology, and epigenetics and their relation to Whitehead's rhythms of education. So I'm looking to biology in order to sort of answer this question on what scientific, biological, or factual basis is the Whiteheadian claim that there are these rhythms of education that we need to attend to, not only for learning, teaching, and research, but also, not only for learning and teaching, but also for research. The first section of my paper, I talk a little bit about the second law of thermodynamics, which is this notion of entropy. And chemical processes and physical processes try to, they proceed such that less stable reactants are transformed into more thermodynamically stable products, and matter is more stable if it doesn't react. But for living organisms try to resist the decay to entropy. That's the central division or distinction between matter and organisms. So as we know, just to reiterate, material and mechanical systems, they are just subject to entropy, whereas living systems, we do things that resist entropy. Metabolism, energy use and energy gathering and that kind of stuff. Replication, we reproduce ourselves. Not only our cells divide and replicate, but also we reproduce ourselves as well. But homeostasis is a concept that underlies both metabolism and replication, and that's one of the concepts that I'd like to focus on. A key feature that defines life is homeostasis, and this is a concept that was developed by Walter B. Cannon, and he was drawing upon the work of physiologist Claude Bernard. And what Bernard observed was that dynamical biological processes serve to preserve the stability of an organism's internal environment from external fluctuations and disturbances, compensating for them. And in defining homeostasis, Cannon pointed to those dynamic processes of stabilization in living systems through which there's a regulation and constant adjustment in order to counterbalance the organism biologically against changing circumstances surrounding their lives, namely preserving constant the conditions of life in the internal environment. Cannon examines all sorts of physiological processes that are going on. For example, biochemical, physiological, he examines various biochemical and physiological things that are going on pertaining to blood proteins, blood calcium, respiration, the operations of the nervous system, all involve homeostatic processes in which there's a self-regulation that's purposive in nature, in that it involves feedback and or negative feedback, which is corrective of imbalances, i.e. excesses or deficiencies, aiming toward the restoration of equilibria. While biologists have traditionally, although not exclusively, concentrated on homeostasis in relation to the physiological and biochemical aspects proper of the organism, we can also suggest that homeostasis implicitly connects to the affective and emotional dimensions of living creatures, mental processes, mind, behavior, learning and education, as well as the organization of societies. But while in relation to homeostasis proper, living systems purposefully achieve equilibria by way of dynamic processes, chronobiologists, which is sort of another of these new frontiers in biology, tell us that overlying these homeostatic processes, the set points representing the equilibria to be achieved are also subject to rhythmic oscillation and change. According to chronobiologists Russell Foster and Leon Kreitzman in a book entitled The Rhythms of Life, the biological clocks that control the daily lives of every living thing, when it comes to the living world, biology is full of rhythms. And in this paragraph here, I just provide a quote from their book pertaining to the circadian rhythm pertaining to body temperature, which just gives you a simple example of how homeostasis and how these rhythms, these oscillating rhythms operate in relation to physiology. Okay, and what the chronobiologists add is that pertaining to the circadian rhythm pertaining to body temperature is skittering about a set point as negative feedback mechanisms attempt to maintain the set point. But they add that the set point itself varies or cycles over a 24-hour period, falling in the night and rising rhythmically during the day. So homeostasis, as is commonly understood, is now viewed as somewhat more complex than simple negative feedback. And overlaying homeostasis, there are these chronobiological rhythms that are synchronized with the natural rhythms of the environment. For example, sunlight and darkness, day and night as the Earth wobbles and spins while orbiting the sun, the seasons, and temperature fluctuation. So there's a connection to the physical world as well. Yeah, I'll just do half my paper. I won't do the Waddington part, but I'll talk about it maybe in discussion. One thing that we should recognize is that there's a danger with chronobiology to sort of reduce the living organism to a clock, which is counter to the whole point of this conference. This mechanistic view of the Cartesian variety seemingly seeping in, but hopefully we avoid that. So chronobiology has become the recognized term for many of those who study biological rhythms. There's even a journal of biological rhythms that's out there. This is a scientific journal. It's an acceptable scientific journal. So in general, we find that there's a double helical spiraling movement in which novel homeostatic processes emerge in compensation for the imbalances of previous ones and for new environmental conditions and constraints. And it's here to be noted that philosophies, artwork, religions, and cultural teachings that are emphasized that we ought to practice the middle way between excess and deficiency, including those of Aristotle, Taoism, Hegel, and Whitehead, can be interpreted largely as representations of the wisdom of homeostasis and of biological rhythms as applicable to body, mind, and nature. Even the whole notion of sustainable development is a variation on this theme. And in the next sections of this paper, I go through various sections of the Tao Te Ching. I talk a little bit about Wu Wei and the cycling, oscillating process that we all undergo. And there's a connection to modern science with what the Tao Te Ching suggests, that there's this reversion from excess to deficiency and vice versa. And what we want to do is kind of maintain the mean state and not go to excess. So this is representation of a biological reality. So most of this paper, or little bits of this paper, talk about all that. Just to summarize what's been presented so far, Whitehead's rhythm of education is representative of a homeostatic and chronobiological process unto itself, and the new frontiers of homeostasis and chronobiology offer to us the exciting prospect of being able to study education and its putative Whiteheadian rhythms from a biological and scientific perspective. And in the second part of this paper that I won't get to, I talk a little bit about Conrad Hal Waddington, who's the father of epigenetics, and his extension of Whitehead's rhythm of education to research. And what he suggests is that in order to develop what he calls biological wisdom that can operate as a check and a balance against the type of mechanistic reductionism that you find and is necessary in science, one phase of the scientific method needs to embody or embrace this kind of holistic reflection, so as to lay bare the abstractions that may be created as a result of that reductionistic method. And so Waddington, who's a Whiteheadian, he embraces biological wisdom, and he thinks that we need to embrace this kind of holistic reflection, not just simply getting rid of mechanistic reductionism, but sort of being able to identify the abstractions that are created, which go and cause things like bee colony collapse disorder. If you're a scientist and your discoveries automatically are used for a biotechnological purpose, and you develop some sort of systemic pesticide like a neonicotinoid, and you're not thinking holistically, well, you're liable to make this large creation, not do the tests necessary, not do the thinking necessary, put the thing out in the world, which destroys ecologies or it destroys the environment. Okay?
I have just a tiny one.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this chronobiology research before. So I heard you mention it was in a journal, but how widespread is this?
It's still one of the new frontiers, although there's more and more research being done. There's 3 or 4 books I could sort of recommend. There's articles being published, and it's not just nonsense. It's a new frontier of biology. It doesn't. You could go reduction. You could embrace the reductionistic method, the mechanistic method in it. Hopefully, that's a danger that can be avoided. But it is something that can help us ground Whitehead's philosophizing in concrete reality, pertaining to education and other things.
Yeah. Since the 1970s, I think, there was a research group in Munich, for instance, and some others in the United States, and I just recently came across that, and it's very interesting from a Whiteheadian perspective.
Yeah, there's several books that have been published just since 2005 on this topic.
Aschoff, I think, the German Aschoff and stuff. Yeah, really, it's very interesting.
Yeah, so it's not. I haven't given you, absolute proof, but I've shown that there's a way to try to connect Whitehead's philosophizing with scientific reality.
They even try to apply it for medical reasons because the cancer cells, for instance, have chronobiological rhythms. And so they use when they should place the medication best during that rhythm of the cells in splitting up again. So it's very interesting stuff. But
right, there's a certain time and place that normally a doctor would say, you need to take your pill every day. Why doesn't he just say just keep popping?
Exactly.
I mean, there's a rhythm to it that you need to embrace. That's a very good example of chronobiology in action.
Using.
Also, I try to develop different areas in which homeostasis and these kind of rhythms can be talked about. For example, with respect to epigenetics, which is a new frontier of biology as well, and even the regulation of gene expression, contains the elements of those new frontiers, or can be studied as a result of these new areas. Okay, and one of the other things I talk about in the paper is just to get away from. Waddington was a Whiteheadian. He was critical of Julian Huxley, who was one of the architects of the modern synthesis in biology. And Huxley embraced basically a mechanistic metaphysic, whereas Waddington embraced a more holistic Whiteheadian metaphysic. And it just shows you the difference and what biology missed out on when it didn't take Waddington as seriously as it could have. And also, I also bring this back to science education, as I said. We should get students as young as possible to go through these rhythms, to not overemphasize the phase of precision, to embrace generalization, so that when young scientists go out into the world, they don't just invent something that's going to blow up the world, and they don't even think anything about it. Yeah, and there's also the element, and we talked about it before, that we can view some of these philosophies of the middle way, like Taoism, as sort of representations of these rhythms and these biological processes.
Are you done with your presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got. Thank you very much. There's one thing I've really liked about your presentation, and especially in this track, because I think one of the big qualities of an educational system that follows Whitehead's thoughts is the ability to interconnect with other sciences. Yeah, I think that if you look at any other educational approach, they're usually, lonely people on a mountain. There's no connection to other fields. And this is a really nice example for how we can create a system that is not just resembling this biological wisdom that you mentioned, but also resembles ancient tradition like Taoism and modern science. And I think this is the way to go. I'm really thankful.
Sure. I mean, I think it puts things into perspective that it doesn't have to be that Aristotle and modern science are not together, or Taoism and modern science, they're not together. We seemingly think that they're doing that over in the humanities, we're doing this over here, and near the twain shall meet. But there's all sorts of connections that can be made here.
Just one more question for this topic. You have done just a lot of research about it, right? And one more question. Is there any shortcoming of rising education in Whitehead?
Is there any shortage?
Is there any shortcoming or what we mean drawbacks? Limitation.
Of what Whitehead's doing, or what?
Yeah, just Whitehead's rider education. For example, there are 3 phrases, right? And romance, precision, and generalization. Maybe there will be 4 stages, just some other parts.
For science, Waddington thinks that there's 4 stages. He thinks
scientists, 4 stages.
4 stages. He adds 2. He divides precision up into 2. The first one is sort of a logical construction, sort of deductive reasoning, and the second one is experimentation and manipulation of nature. But those 2 sort of make it so that that's what science is about. Science is about precision. But we shouldn't forget, for Waddington, he thinks that we all think that we don't know anything unless we can control it. Well, we need to get outside of that kind of arrogance to some extent in the phase of generalization. Yeah, there should be more precision in a science class as opposed to a humanities class, but that still doesn't, shouldn't make it so that we overemphasize precision at the expense of generalization.
I'm not so sure
Not sure.
about that. less romance in science.
Well, we
It's a rather creative process to be a good scientist. So that's underestimated. That's one of the problems, I think.
romance in science.
In science, yes. And the creativity. You know, you have to find hypotheses. They have to come from somewhere.
Yeah,
And I think romance is very important for creating.
And
Yeah.
vice versa in
Creativity.
humanities too. I mean,
what
Both, yes, both. But not one more than the other. I
Yeah.
have my problems with that.
Waddington also talks about what amounts to romance,
Yeah.
and you know he does give it its due. You know, for example, if you're coming up with a hypothesis or there's some new idea that's generated that other scientists have no truck with, they don't even want to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
He still thinks that that's part of a very important part of the rhythm of research. I think you guys probably want to talk about research and stuff like that, and books and publications. I think, is everybody finished? Okay.